I'm giving an overview of the first chapter of Lewis Vaughn's very nice book, Writing Philosophy, the second edition. And that's a book from Oxford University Press. We're looking at the pages 23 through 20 in the 2018 edition. And the focus here is how to read philosophy. If you're a student in one of my courses, you've been assigned to read this chapter. If not, I still think it's a good overview that you can understand without having read the chapter. There are certain characteristics of philosophy that Vaughn emphasizes here at the start. And one of the things is that philosophical ideas have shaped the world around you. They have affected you whether you realize it or not. Philosophical ideas have been greatly influential through history. They are greatly influential now, but often in more subtle ways, in the background. For example, our founding documents for the United States of America were greatly influenced by the philosopher John Locke. There were many other philosophers influencing Madison and Jefferson and those founding fathers who were behind the founding documents. Those philosophical principles were extremely important, and they continue to be important and influence your life today. What philosophy does is asks whether a belief is worth having. That's what philosophers do. That's what philosophy is about. Now, this is different from other fields of inquiry. For the most part, for example, a scientist might ask specific questions and look for specific answers that all scientists hopefully eventually will agree with. Now, that's not going to be the case with philosophers. So here's some comparisons and some contrasting kinds of questions. A scientist might ask, how do our brains work? Of course, they will be much more detailed as that goes into the studies of the brain. And a philosopher asks questions like, are our brains identical to our minds? Or are our minds something else besides a brain? A lawyer might ask, how's the death penalty applied in Texas? Whereas a philosopher might ask, is capital punishment itself ever morally permissible? And ask about the morality of such things. A scientist might ask, how does a human fetus develop? A philosopher would ask, what is the moral status of a human fetus? So the questions on this screen that philosophers ask can't be answered by science, they can't be answered by attorneys, they can't be answered in other fields. They are under the purview of philosophy. Now, some people have used the word philosophy in slightly different ways than philosophers do. So sometimes people have asked me, well, what's your philosophy? And what they mean by that is having a philosophy of life. And really what we're talking about when people talk about a philosophy of life is a worldview. A worldview is a set of fundamental ideas that help us make sense of the world. And so everyone has a worldview. So these are kind of screening principles, underlying principles. Not everyone has reflected on their worldview, but everyone has one. A worldview is a framework through which we interpret our experiences. So as we go through the day, as we live our lives, we interpret our experiences according to our worldview. And this is one of the reasons why two people can experience the exact same thing, but have very different reactions and very different views of what went on, because they have very different worldviews. Worldviews are shaped by our culture. They're shaped by the particular environment in which we were raised. So by the way we were raised in our family, our school teachers, and worldviews in a sense, in a way, are somewhat related to our genetics, what we are disposed to believe even. Philosophy is not a worldview. Philosophy as a discipline helps us rise above the prejudices in a worldview that may blind us. Philosophy provides the tools to evaluate a worldview. Philosophy can evaluate whether a worldview is a good one to have, whether it's worth believing, those fundamental ideas that make sense of our experiences, whether or not they are reasonable. That's what philosophy does, in contrast. There are four fundamental areas of philosophy. One is metaphysics, the general study of reality, what exists and what could exist. This includes things like causation and properties, and whether or not God exists is actually under the purview of metaphysics. Axiology is a very broad area that is the study of values. It includes ethics or moral philosophy and aesthetics, having to do with beauty and art, and political theory falls under axiology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and beliefs. Why do we believe something? What is knowledge? What is rational to believe? And then finally, logic is the study of argumentation directly. It's the study of correct reasoning. And so it is very foundational to all other fields of philosophy. Vaughn lays out 5 different rules when we are reading philosophy to help us get a good grip on what we are reading. First of all, we need to approach the text with an open mind. Sometimes a certain author or a title or something about an article we're reading causes us to react negatively, but we shouldn't assume that before reading that something is false, and we shouldn't assume that it's true. So unlike when you're reading history or chemistry, a text in an accounting or something like that, you should, in those areas, assume that what you're reading is true, things that you ought to believe and learn. When you're reading philosophy, that's not necessarily the case. You don't presume it's true, and you don't presume it's false either. But you should be charitable. The ideas of philosophers are not silly, they're not ridiculous, they have arguments behind them, and don't assume that an author is stupid, all right? If something's published in philosophy, in particular if it's something that I've assigned, it's not stupid. So ask whether you can give reasons for accepting or rejecting an author's view. That's what's significant when you're approaching the text with an open mind. You have to be open to the idea that this person just might be right. You also have to be open to the idea that this person might be wrong. Second is to read actively and critically. So reading philosophy involves active reading. You cannot speed read philosophy. You cannot just skim philosophy. It simply doesn't work. When philosophers write, they try to be concise. They try to use words very carefully. And so the specific words used, the specific sentences, how they are constructed, these things are very important for a philosophical text. Reading philosophy is not like reading fiction. It's not like watching a show or a movie where you suspend disbelief. You just allow what you see or hear to be taken as true. We don't do that when we're reading philosophy. We are careful and critical readers, so you have to read slowly, you have to read deliberately, and yes, often repeatedly. It's normal to have to read a philosophical text more than once. This is true even for those of us who have PhDs in philosophy. When I'm first reading an article, I often need to read it twice to feel like I really know what's going on in the article. Third, you need to identify the conclusion first, and then consider where the premises are. What's the argument? There may be several sub-arguments in a text that support premises, but there's also going to be a main conclusion that you need to identify first for any philosophical work. Fourth, you should outline, paraphrase, or summarize the argument, or do a combination of these 3 things. An outline can help you see the structure of the article, and that'll help make the sub-arguments more clear. A paraphrase is when you put the full argument into your own words, And so that can be fairly cumbersome and time consuming, but very helpful for understanding what you've read. A summary involves a paraphrase, but it also condenses the argument into fewer words. So you're trying to take a larger piece of work and then condense it into a smaller piece of text. And for the most part, what I'm doing in this presentation is providing an outline and a summary of Vaughn's first chapter. So I'm displaying or modeling what we mean when we say to do this. The fifth rule is to evaluate the argument and then formulate a tentative judgment. So when we read philosophy, we evaluate the text. So understanding the text is just the first step. It's a necessary step. You cannot jump to evaluation. You must make sure that you understand it first. But then you eventually need to move on to evaluating the text. And you evaluate the argument by considering two different questions. You assess whether the premises support the conclusion, whether the arguments presented are good arguments, and then you assess whether the premises are in fact true. And you can see the text, especially the pages 13 to 20, for examples of applying these rules. And so those are very good examples that Vaughn provides there. There are 5 common mistakes that he describes on page 12. I just refer you to that. These involve reading philosophy the same way you might read a technical report or a novel, prejudging the author of the text, failing to evaluate, trying to speed read or skim, and then not reading actively or carefully. These mistakes, in other words, are not following the rules that we just laid out. So to sum up the rules and provide a quick review here, first of all, approach the text with an open mind, read actively and critically, identify the conclusion first, and then the premises, outline, paraphrase, or summarize the argument, and then finally, after you've clearly understood the argument, evaluate the argument and formulate a tentative judgment.